There is a very specific type of person walking around today carrying the memory of a dead world. A world that didn't just evolve, but vanished entirely, leaving almost no forensic evidence that it ever existed. You can't Google what the texture of that time felt like. You can't pull up a screenshot of the profound silence of an empty afternoon. If you are one of these people, you are a ghost of the analog age, the last human beings who will ever know what it meant to disappear completely just by walking out your front door. You are the sole witnesses to a silent collision between the way human history was always lived and the way it will be lived forevermore. Welcome to the Psychology Guy. If you have ever felt this strange, unnamable dislocation in your own life, hit the subscribe button to support the channel so we can keep untangling these deep psychological mysteries together. You are the person who remembers the precise, tactile sensation of rewinding a VHS tape before driving it back to Blockbuster, and yet, you also remember the exact week you downloaded your very first MP3. You are not someone who only knows the endless scroll of streaming. You are not someone who never touched the fragile ribbon of a cassette tape. You lived through both, back to back, right in the messy, agonizing center of figuring out who you were. For decades, psychologists and marketers didn't quite know what to do with you. If you were born somewhere between 1977 and 1985, you were awkwardly lumped into the cynical detachment of Generation X, or carelessly folded into the native digital fluency of Millennials. But you never truly belonged to either. It wasn't until 2014 that sociologist Sarah Starnob finally gave this group a name: xennials, a microgeneration. Some researchers lovingly call you the Oregon Trail generation, referencing that old-school computer game. Always navigating uncertain terrain with limited supplies, figuring out your next move as the ground shifted beneath you. You are not a broad, sweeping generational cohort like Boomers or Gen Z. You are an 8 or 9 year wide anomaly, a highly specific blip in time. What happened inside that tiny window left a psychological mark that broader categories simply cannot explain. Not because you are special in some superior sense, but because of what happened around you, and more importantly, when it happened. Think about what your daily life actually looked like before the internet existed. You passed intimate, high-stakes notes in class on intricately folded notebook paper that could get confiscated and read aloud. You made plans to meet someone at a specific street corner at a specific hour, and then you just went there and waited. There was no tracking dot on a screen, no text message to say they were 5 minutes away. You either showed up or you didn't, and people remembered exactly what kind of person you were. But the most profound difference is what happened to your mistakes. That visceral fight at a house party, that deeply embarrassing thing you said in front of the wrong person, that incredibly awkward phase in 9th grade, it just faded. Nobody archived your humiliation. Nobody screenshotted your worst, most fragile moments. It lived briefly in the minds of a few peers and slowly dissolved into something softer. The human brain is actually built by evolution for exactly this process. To let things shift over time, to keep what still matters, and to mercifully release what does not. Growing up in a world that permitted that psychological decay meant your childhood could become a story. It was a fluid narrative you owned and shaped, not a permanent, unerasable digital file you were forced to live inside forever. But just as you were writing the final chapters of that unrecorded, deeply analog childhood, right as you were stepping into the fragile vulnerability of your late teens and early 20s, the entire architecture of reality changed. It did not happen slowly. It was not a gentle generational drift that you could watch approaching from a safe distance. It was an overnight rupture. One moment, connection meant hoping the coiled phone cord stretched far enough down the hallway for a private conversation, and the next, it was the screeching, mechanical dial-up tone announcing the arrival of the internet. Then came the mobile phones, the early chaotic frontiers of Friendster and MySpace, the silent, pervasive takeover of broadband. Within a handful of years, the physical world you had spent your entire life mastering essentially stopped existing as the absolute center of human interaction, and a completely different, digital dimension appeared in its place. This timing was not just a cultural coincidence. It was a profound neurological event. Research published in the journal Nature Neuroscience has shown that the part of the human brain responsible for learning entirely new, complex operational systems keeps developing and remains highly malleable until right around the age of 25. As a xennial, you hit the absolute peak of the digital revolution, precisely inside that closing window of neuroplasticity. You were old enough to have a fully formed, independent identity rooted in the physical world, yet young enough that your brain was still genuinely open to absorbing the new digital reality as a foundational skill rather than an exhausting chore. Generation X had to learn the internet the way a tired adult learns a second language. They are functional, sometimes highly fluent, but always operating with a slight, noticeable accent, never quite effortless. Younger millennials and Gen Z, on the other hand, grew up entirely inside the machine. For them, the internet is not a tool they picked up. It is the water they swim in. They do not know what it means to be dry. You are the only group walking the earth who naturally holds both. You carry the profound, cellular memory of what it felt like to leave your house and be genuinely, beautifully unreachable for hours at a time, answering to no one but the setting sun. And yet, today, you also move through 17 different messaging platforms, Slack channels, and email threads without the slightest drop in operational anxiety. You bridge the divide perfectly. Not because you are exceptionally gifted, but because the door of history was propped open at exactly the right moment of your cognitive development, and then it slammed shut forever behind you. But there is a darker, much heavier part of this story that almost nobody talks about, a quiet trauma that compounds the technological whiplash. You were not just the guinea pigs for the digital age. You were the shock absorbers for a collapsing economy. You enthusiastically entered the job market right around the dot-com bust in the early 2000s. You were getting your first real jobs, signing leases on your first apartments, making your very first earnest attempts at building an independent adult life, and the floor dropped out almost immediately. The promises you were raised on, study hard, get a degree, follow the rules, and the system will take care of you, evaporated overnight. So, you dusted yourself off. You rebuilt slowly, carefully, and meticulously. And just as you were finally reaching what should have been your most stable, consolidating years, the moment you were supposed to be buying homes, starting families, and planting deep, secure roots, 2008 happened. The Great Recession swallowed the horizon. Economists have a term for what this does to a cohort of people. They call it a scaring effect. Financial instability experienced during the formative, early stages of a career leaves a deep psychological mark that simply does not disappear. When the stock market eventually recovers or when the unemployment rate drops, you can see this invisible scar tissue operating in your life right now, hiding in small, quiet, everyday decisions. It is the emergency savings fund that never, ever feels large enough, no matter how many zeros are in the bank account. It is the elaborate, multi-tiered backup plan you construct in your head, even when there is absolutely no obvious reason to need one. It is that slight, persistent hesitation you feel in your chest before committing to anything permanent, even when everything looks completely fine on paper. If you have noticed this exhaustive pattern in yourself and always assumed it was a personal failing, let me tell you something incredibly vital. That is not an anxiety disorder. It is not a flaw in your character. It is closer to muscle memory. It is your nervous system remembering a sudden, catastrophic collapse that your logical mind has been desperately trying to move past for 2 decades. That deeply ingrained survival instinct doesn't just dictate how you manage your bank account today. It fundamentally alters how you absorb the quiet, daily friction of the modern workplace. You often find yourself sitting in a brightly lit conference room or a scattered Zoom grid, acting as the completely involuntary diplomat between 2 entirely different dimensions of human thought. To your left are your older colleagues, the ones who crave established process, rigid hierarchy, and the physical proof of productivity. To your right are the younger ones, the digital natives who demand blistering speed, absolute autonomy, and the right to disconnect. You are the only person in the room who genuinely speaks both of their languages. You are the one carefully explaining to the eager 20-something why patience, structure, and institutional memory still hold immense value in a world obsessed with disruption. And in the very next breath, you are the one gently translating for the 60-year-old executive why a late-night email is a violation of personal boundaries rather than a badge of corporate loyalty. You perform this delicate, high-wire act every single day, and to leadership, it looks like a tremendous professional asset. People probably praise you for being reasonable, adaptable, and a grounding force for the team. But being the person who bridges every generational gap means you are constantly, physically, absorbing the raw friction between 2 incompatible realities. You make the chaotic systems function. You smooth the jagged edges over so everyone else can comfortably coexist, all without anyone ever stopping to ask what that constant mediation is actively costing you. Psychologists have a term for this specific kind of psychological wear and tear: emotional labor. When you carry that burden habitually, you eventually stop noticing that you are even doing it. It stops feeling like a concentrated effort and just starts feeling like the normal, heavy baseline of your existence. If you have spent the last decade being the reliable one, the pragmatic one, and yet you harbor a deep, unnamable tiredness in your bones that a weekend of sleep can never seem to cure, please hear this. That exhaustion is not a personality flaw, and it is not a sign of weakness. That is simply the brutal, invisible cost of holding 2 different worlds together for a very long time without ever being allowed to put them down. So, come back to that VHS tape for a second. The kid who meticulously rewound that black plastic cassette before driving it back to the rental store, and then effortlessly figured out how to pirate Evan P3s a few years later, did not do that because they were some sort of evolutionary marvel. You did it because you had absolutely no other choice. The world changed, and you changed right along with it, quietly, without melodrama, and without losing the core of the analog person you were before the glowing screens took over. You watched an entire reality end. It didn't happen with a cinematic explosion or a clear announcement. It just slowly dissolved when you weren't looking directly at it. And then you watched a new reality boot up, and you stepped right across the threshold. Most human beings throughout history only ever get one world. You got the seam. You are the exact, ragged place where one version of human life was violently stitched into a completely different one. You learned not by reading it in a textbook, but by simply surviving the transition, that who you are does not have to be permanently determined by the world you started in. In a time when the ground keeps shifting under everyone's feet, the fact that you have already practiced landing upright when the earth moves, without ever losing track of where you came from, is not just a quirk of your birth year. It is a profound, unteachable superpower.